Well, I'm very happy to see that we have a very large attendance this afternoon. And I think the obvious reason is that we're all very much aware of what a special occasion this is. Well, I know it's almost unnecessary, but I would like to say a few words on Professor Ankersmith's professional career. And I will be very, very brief. Until 2010, when he went into retirement, Frank Ankersmith worked as a full-time professor at the University of Groningen, where he taught intellectual history and philosophy of history. He's the author of over 250 scientific articles and 15 books, among which I would like to mention Narrative Logic, History and Tropology, Sublime Historical Experience, and Meaning, Truth, and Reference in Historical Representation. Unfortunately, only 2 of them have been translated into Spanish. These are the ones, Historia y Tropología and Experiencia Histórica Sublime. The rest of them, you can find them either in English or in Dutch, or I think there's some in Portuguese as well, right?
In Chinese.
And in Chinese and many other languages.
It might be very helpful.
Yeah, so don't forget, Russian too. He founded and was until recently the chief editor of the Journal of the Philosophy of History, and is a member of the editorial boards of some of the most prestigious journals in the field, such as History and Theory and Rethinking History. I would like to add a personal note to that and say that he's one of the most generous and kind, eminent visiting professors that I've had the chance to meet, and you'll see it yourselves as well. Well, if Professor Ankersmith doesn't mind me simplifying his work, I would say that 2 main subjects that are intimately intertwined have oriented his writings. One has to do with the question on how to account for the writing of history, and the second one with the question about how can there be a past at all. Historical representation and historical experience are the key concepts that have allowed him to offer an answer to each of those questions. I will hand over now to Professor Ankersmith, whose today's talk is entitled Individual and Collective Nostalgia. But I would like, well, I think we should offer him a warm welcome to our university with a round of applause.
Well, Aurelia, thanks very much for this wonderful introduction. I'd also like to thank the authorities of the University of Mexico to have invited me, and especially, of course, Aurelia Solera herself for several things. In the first place, for having taken the initiative to invite me to come here, to actually invite me, and to have taken care of all the logistic details that are involved in such a very large project, getting someone from another part of the world to here in Mexico. She did it wonderful, and well, we already been talking to each other over the email. Already became clear to us that we could get on very well with each other, and we found out that much also yesterday when I had arrived already, and we visited a few places in Morelia, which is a lovely city, as well. I could what I could completely agree with the stories that I heard about Aurelia. Nothing about this has been exaggerated. It's a wonderful place, and so we walked around and then had dinner with some Mexican specialties, and well, I had the idea this promises to be a great time that I'll be having here, and all the more do I hope that I shall be able to tell you something that is worthwhile. I should add that I have specifically a warm feeling for Mexico, and this, I should mention this since, to be honest, I'm the prototypical housebird. I don't like to leave my house very often and do it as little as possible. But Well, I have been several times before to Mexico. This is the fourth time that I'm actually here. And each time that I came to Mexico, I found the people so hospitable. I found the countryside so beautiful, the cities so fabulous. I was so happy here. It was like a homecoming. So even when I say, well, that was more or less my decision. When I retired, I don't think I'm going anymore, well, to conferences or to giving presentations everywhere else in the world. Then I always made this exception for Mexico. To put it this way, with no 10 horses, you could get me from the place where I live to the United States, to some university there. But it needs only an invitation from Aurelia to get me here. And that's about the situation. Well, I shall be talking then today about nostalgia. And let me say right away the following with regard to the format of my talk. It's not an awfully difficult topic, but nevertheless, it could happen that you cannot follow right away what I'm saying. And then it's better that you put up immediately your finger and ask and say to me, well, could you explain that somewhat clearer? All the more so since when one of you has a problem with what I'm saying, it's most likely that others have this problem as well. So then we should address the issue at once. If you, well, have some problems with the argument as such, or have some questions about it, I think these are the kind of things that had best be postponed to the end of my talk. So, to put it all together, divide things in two categories. On the one hand, the more, well, let's say, informative questions, questions that you say, well, I don't understand what you say, can please explain it once again? And the other type of questions that go a little further, and that would be a good point of departure for the discussion at the end of my talk. And then one more thing, I know I have a rather soft voice, so if I forget to speak in the microphone or speak too soft to be heard, also you should tell me so immediately. Okay?
So can you hear? Yeah? Not very much. Okay.
Well, I'll speak in two microphones, so and is there a third one, by the way?
I don't know. You should ask.
Well, nostalgia then. Well, the theme of nostalgia is a very old one. It may even be that it's part of your nostalgia, maybe it's part even of what it means to be a human being, so that it goes back down to the history of man, to the dawn of mankind. That as soon as human beings settled on this world, or well, evolved from the apes, that something like nostalgia came into being already. But this is something that we do not know. We have only to deal with the documented sources, but these do also go already quite far back. I mentioned you two here as the outset of my paper. In the first place, I'll say a few things about Homer, and in the next place, something about the Bible. Then with Homer, nostalgia is clearly most important in the part of Ilias and Odyssey, in the Odyssey. So when Odyssey returns from Troy to his beloved island Ithaca, waiting there to see again his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus and his dog Argos, and as always he has this pains for getting back to the island of Ithaca. It takes him 10 years to come there, but in the end he arrives there. When you read what Homer has to tell about this, it's actually a very positive account. Homer has no unpleasant things to say about nostalgia. It's a good thing, and simply because it's natural. And of course, well, you know, the Greek mentality is something that is natural is in most cases good. So for the Greeks, nostalgia was a natural and a good thing. Things are already more complicated with the Bible. there you have a double story. On the one hand, for the Bible, the nostalgia was a good thing. The prototypical example is, of course, Exodus, when the people of Egypt that had been led by Joseph to Egypt then returned under the guidance of Moses again to the Holy Country, and to all the Jeude memoir of the people of Abraham and Jacob that they still knew lay there. And that was a return to their original country, to the Eretz Israel, for which they had always had this nostalgic yearning, and they wanted to come back there. And so here, clearly, the whole Exodus was, of course, went under the guidance of God. Think of the passage through the Red Sea. This was what the Bible was considered to be a very good thing. But on the other hand, you have the story of Lot and his wife, and Lot and his wife and his family were said to were thrown out of Sodom and Gomorrah by God, these sinful cities. Only they could be saved because they were of God's people, but on condition that they wouldn't look back in nostalgia. But Lot's wife, she felt this nostalgia for the sexually unbound world, I shall say, of Sodom and Gomorrah, and therefore was transformed by God into into a column of salt, which is why the Dead Sea is still tastes so salty nowadays. So there in the Bible, the account of nostalgia is already mixed. If you compare these two stories, you must say, and this is the assessment of Erich Auerbach, who has in his famous book of Mimesis a comparison of the Bible and Homer. And he says, well, you see here that the Bible is much more subtle with regard to all the intricacies and the complications of the human mind, and is therefore far more capable of seeing, well, that there are different sides to nostalgia. And that is why, because the Bible is so, the authors of the Bible are so much more subtle psychologists. That's why they knew so much more about nostalgia than the Greeks knew. But this is the image. The Greeks were very positive about nostalgia, and then the Bible was more negative. Well, now, if we now turn to our own time, then we can say that the Bible has won in the end. For in our own time, nostalgia doesn't have very much credits. It is not regarded very highly. One says, to begin with, that somebody who has nostalgic feelings is somebody who stands with his back to the future. And that's not something that we find a very recommendable attitude. We shall also find that somebody who is nostalgic is, because of this, because of standing with his back to the future, often incapable of acting at all, or at least of acting in a sensible and meaningful way, because he doesn't take the future into his account, which is, of course, a basic condition for meaningful action. And then you could go even one further step and say that nostalgia is a kind of psychopathology, and a kind of psychopathology taking the form that it leads to an idealization of the past. And because of this idealization of the past, you are incapable of living in the present. And that's, well, the basic form of this psychopathology, people not being able to live in the past, in the present, but only live in the past, and therefore are continuously unhappy and clearly, in a way, sick. Well, but with regard to this idealization of the past, by nostalgia, one should be careful. And here we get again immediately to the word of nostalgia itself. As you may know, the word nostalgia is a compositum It consists of two components. In the first place, nostos, which means returning, and algos, which means pain. So if you have the term nostalgia, it's a pain or aching to return. And that's of course the case with somebody who suffers from nostalgia or homesickness. He aches, he feels the pain, he wishes to return to the place where he was. This neologism was dubbed, was intended, was proposed by a Swiss medic, a certain Johannes Hofer, who wrote a dissertation in 1688, which was called Dissertatio Medica de Nostalgia, of only 11 pages. So if you wish to write a dissertation well, in the days of 1688 and 11 pages was enough, well, that was a good time to write dissertations. And then become very famous as well. But this dissertation made a big impression, and this word nostalgia that became part of the European vocabulary. But when writing this dissertation, the research material that Hofer had used, that were Swiss mercenary soldiers. So people who were born in Switzerland, on the meadows, on the Alps, with the cows, with the bells, etc. And then, because they were supposed to be good fighters, sent out all over Europe to fight, the dukes and the kings that, for example, the Spanish or the French kings or something had hired them for to battle. So these, being a mercenary, they could get everywhere in Europe, and often very far away from their original Switzerland. And when this happens, it could take place with several of these soldiers, that they felt homesickness, that they felt this nostalgia. And that is just the original kind of nostalgia, is this nostalgia of wishing to go back to the place for which you have this nostalgic feelings. But when they went back to Switzerland and heard again the bells of these cows and saw again these meadows of Switzerland, well, that was immediately the end of their nostalgia. For that was what they had desire to see again. That was the kind of world that they wanted to have around themselves. So this is a kind of nostalgia that is easily helped. This is not a sickness that you have to suffer very long. The remedy for the illness is very easy. Just go back to the place where you come from, and the problems are over. At this stage, it's a good idea to distinguish between two forms of nostalgia. On the one hand, spatial nostalgia. So that's the kind of nostalgia that you should associate with the Swiss mercenaries. And on the other hand, temporal nostalgia. So the nostalgia for a certain time in your past. And there is, of course, these are, of course, different things. For you can, the Swiss soldiers could go back to Switzerland, but you cannot go back to the past. Those two things, admittedly, may strongly reinforce each other. For example, if in case you grew up here in Morelia, love the city as much as I do already, and the surrounding, etc. And this is where you grew up, and the city you liked, and then you find yourself, in Dubai or in some awful Solos American city, then these things go together. On the one hand, there is the memory of your youth, that's temporal nostalgia, and you are not on the place where you want to be, and that's spatial nostalgia. So spatial nostalgia and temporal nostalgia can very well go together and then reinforce themselves, but you should keep them apart. It also follows that if we speak about these distortions of nostalgia, you can expect them far more easily from temporal nostalgia than from spatial nostalgia. Spatial nostalgia is something that can be checked. I mean, if you have this spatial nostalgia for Switzerland or for Morelia, and then you have an idea, if only I were there, then the world would look like this, and then you go back to Morelia or to Switzerland, and you find what you expected. So there is an objective test, so to speak, for the object of your nostalgic yearning. But it's not the case with temporal nostalgia, for the past no longer exists. So you can no longer go back to the past and actually check whether your nostalgic yearnings for a certain part of your youth or whatever part of your life is actually in agreement with what your life in your youth or in that other part of your life has been. Okay? So this gives to this temporal variant of nostalgia a far greater freedom of movement and a far greater of movement with regard to distortion and to idealization. And that can sometimes lead to funny results. I'll give you one example that I came across myself, and this like follows that when I was young, my mother had a friend who had passed the years between 1942 and 1945 in the concentration camps of the Japanese. And, well, of course, these concentration camps of the Japanese were not as bad as the extermination camps of the Germans. And it is also true that that is the incredible thing that how bad human circumstances can become. People remain laughing sometimes and find something funny. Even in Germany, this was the case. Read, for example, this wonderful book by David Gross, Life and Fate. And he gives there, well, perhaps the best description of the concentration camps in Germany that has ever been given. But even these people could still laugh in the deepest misery, and whereas they were looking death continuously in the eyes. And so it was also with this friend of my mother. She said, oh yeah, we had also a lot of fun in the Japanese camp. And then she said, even went as far as, she said, I sometimes discover myself, I feel a profound nostalgia for this Japanese concentration camp. Yeah, well, she said, at the same time, I'm quite sure it was the worst time of my life, and not for all the gold in the world, I wouldn't go back there for a day. So, whereas she objectively knew that was a very bad time for her and for her family and her children, she nevertheless felt this nostalgic yearning for the concentration camps. And then you also ask yourself, how could this be? How can this happen into one and the same person? Apparently some kind of personality split, that one part of her personality wants to go, well, believes at least to go back to the concentration to the concentration camps of the Japanese, and the other part does not wish to do so. And then you ask yourself, is there not a certain third personality who has the right to decide about whom of the two is right? Well, perhaps such a person is there or not, but it shows in any way that there is much truth in the old observation by Pascal that le cœur a ses raisons que la raison ne connaît pas, that the heart has many reasons that that reason does not know. But to return then to the distortions by nostalgia, temporal nostalgia, these have been severely criticized, and that gets me to the first two quotes on the handouts and here. No questions up till now? No? Apparently not. Well, So many people have been very much aware that nostalgia often results in a distortion of our conceptions of the past, and then they find this a worrying phenomenon, and even go sometimes as far to condemn nostalgia for this. For example, this first man who is mentioned there, Michael Cameron, and he says nostalgia is essentially history without guilt. Heritage, and that's, well, he means nostalgia there, is something that suffuses us with pride rather than with shame. Well, I could illustrate this with a story about, we talked yesterday about Johann Maurits from Nassau, and the story is something that is very much in the media now in my country. There was once a certain Johann Maurits von Nassau, and he was governor of Brazil in the period that Spain had occupied Portugal in the beginning of the 17th century. And then the Dutch occupied Brazil. And the governor of Brazil was this Johann Maurits von Nassau. And it's said that he did there a whole lot of good work. I don't know, but I read it in the newspapers. He did a lot for the infrastructure and for education and for the sciences and the arts. And it seems that the Brazilians nowadays even have the highest regards of him for these things. But he came back then and built the Mauritshuis. And some of you may have heard of it, for its house, presently the Mauritshuis houses the second most beautiful collection of 17th century art in the Netherlands. The first, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, but then in The Hague you have het Mauritshuis. And that Mauritshuis that was built by this Johann Maurits from Brazil. But 2 weeks ago it was in the Dutch newspapers, a big story, that the statue that you had in the Mauritshuis, the statue of Johann Maurits, that had been removed. And then people said, why has this statue been removed? Yeah, said the people of the Maurits. This was a crook, this man, this Johann Maurits. He has enriched himself, there was slavery in Brazil. And he came back from Brazil with more money than the money he had when he came to Brazil. So this is somebody we cannot suffer to have in our museum. Well, that was the beginning of a whole discussion if this is the way how you could deal with the past. But the upshot here, in the context of my talk, is here that we certainly have, of course, a tendency to say, well, as the Dutch have, we had our Dutch golden century, we did all kind of good things in our own eyes, still now, and then tend to forget about all the atrocities and the iniquities that also went with it. And this is what Carmen has, that's his point. He wishes to say that because we like parts of our past, so as the Dutch like this aspect of the 17th century, because we like certain parts of our past, we like to pass over, well, the moral iniquities of that period. Well, the same it is with Charles Mayer. Nostalgia is to memory what kitsch is to art. And then, well, the crucial term is kitsch, and there the idea is that kitsch is a term that confuses the categories of the ethical and of the aesthetical. So in the sense, if you make something, if you succeed in making something look nice, then the moral hesitations that you might have with regard to it tend to be pushed to the background. It leads there to a dumbing your moral sense. And this is what, according to Meyer, is affected by nostalgia. And once again, from a moral point of view, nostalgia is an objectionable phenomenon that we should be very careful with. Well, you may have your doubts about this, the very idea of making things look nicer than they are, whether this always is morally reprehensible. Think, for example, you live in an occupied country in Europe during the German occupations, during the German occupation. and you have Jews in your house. And then a German soldier knocks on your door and asks you whether you hide Jews. And then you say no. Then you make the reality look nicer than it is. For, well, in the eyes of the German at least, the bad thing is that you have this German, this Jew in your house. But, well, every sensible person will say, of course, this is the right thing to say. In a case like this, you say the nice thing and not the truth, with all the horrible consequences that it has. Unless, of course, you are a Kantian, for as you may know, Kant said that you might never lie. So even if Kant would have stood in this door with the German soldier, then he would say, well, I'm very sorry, but yes, I have a Jew in my house, because my ethical categorical imperative forbids me to lie even to German soldiers. A most peculiar kind of ethics is this. I think the upshot of this argument is, of course, that we should, well, be somewhat reluctant to go too far with this condemnation of nostalgia since it might idealize the past. This is also this more sanguine, this more relaxed attitude with regard to these idealizations by nostalgia. You will find also in Margalit, Avishai Margalit, the following person I will mention. And well, I have to explain something of the background. It was like this: Avishai Margalit, when being a young man, and he was a soldier, and he needed some money for his education. And then they told him, well, what you can do is that you can become the mentor of some 30 to 40 children from the diaspora. And you will earn some money with this, and then, well, you accompany them for a few years, and then you will have the money for your study. So he did this. And then 50 years later, it was decided that there should be a reunion. So all these former pupils of him came together and started telling to each other stories about these years, 50 years ago, when Margalit had been their mentor. And then Margalit writes the following about this. I was struck by how nostalgic and idealizing their memories were. Their memories were far more detailed and vivid than mine, partly because they rehearsed them so much more. But detailed as their memories were, they were highly idealized, not just stylized, but idealized. This puzzled me. So what he wishes to say here is that when these former pupils started to talk about, well, their shared past, they stylized their memories, and by doing so, idealized it. By talking about it, they gave them a certain form, but this form was not absolutely arbitrary. No, it was the form which had the aim of making it look nicer than it 50 years ago actually must have been. And that happened then. But Margalit said, well, this is true, this is in a way regrettable, of course, for the reality was different, but nevertheless, let not with Cameron and Meyer make too much of it. This is not something that we should barely worry about. This is a kind of idealization that is relatively innocent. But, and that's actually why I have introduced Margalit here in my talk, he discovered something else, and which is of far more interest. And this is that when these former pupils of him started to talk to each other, they started telling each other things that they hadn't all lived through themselves. But by hearing it, they made it into experience of themselves. So as Arvid, I better quote it here. But then nostalgia, especially collective nostalgia, may turn into vicarious nostalgia by plugging one's memory to first-hand memories of others. So what happened is that the memory of one of these pupils was plugged into the memory of others of those pupils. Indeed, the two sides, the conflict, and now I'll get to that later on. This is what happened. Nostalgic memories happen to be contagious. You can infect other people with your nostalgic memories. It's something, and that seems very odd to us, for we think that nostalgic memories must be a very private feeling and not accessible, and that cannot be provoked by others than us. But this is what Abishai Margalit discovered when he heard his former pupils talk. He discovered there, he observed there the fact that these nostalgic memories could be brought over, other people could be affected, so that they had memories that they never actually had themselves. It could be talked into having other nostalgic memories. And this is no longer so innocent as Margalit insisted. For example, and that goes, the rest in the quotation speaks about this. Indeed, the two sides of the conflict in our debatable land, Israel-Palestine, are situated with vicarious nostalgia. There's all in contagious and infected nostalgia that is being taught into the Israelis and into the Palestinians. Even if the use of return is by now mostly metaphorical, it still remains tremendous evocative power in both communities. Vicarious nostalgia is as strong as primary nostalgia. So even if it is vicarious nostalgia that has been put into you by others, that may just be as effective and have as strong an effect on you as if it was your own nostalgic memory. Well, I wish to say a few more things about this phenomenon of the contagiousness of memory. For it works also on the individual scale, and then it can take on many interesting forms. I suppose you will all be acquainted with it, with the phenomenon of contagious nostalgia. For example, you listen to Chopin, the composer of nostalgia, of nostalgic memory par excellence. You hear, for example, the beginning of the second ballade by Chopin, or the second last nocturnes of the Opus Posthume. And, well, I suppose that most of you will, when you hear this music, start thinking back of your youth and of how nice it or how wonderful your youth has been. But it is it's an infection. You have been infected for this nostalgia by Chopin. It can also happen by drawings, or paintings. And now I shall give you an example of my own. There is a Dutch painter and drawer, a certain Jo Spier, who lived from 1900 to 1987. And everything that he painted, all of his drawings have this aura of the nostalgia, of nostalgia. And that also the effect that it has on me. I mentioned an example. He grew up in a little place called Zutphen. And he has a number of drawings of what Zutphen was in his youth. When I see these photos, then I also have immediately nostalgic feelings. And not surprisingly so, since I was born in Deventer. That's a place some 10 to 15 miles north of Zutphen. And also situated on the River IJssel, both Hanseatic cities of the Hanseatic League, with a large medieval center, etc. So these cities have much in common. So it's not amazing that these nostalgic memories of Spier immediately have their resonance in me. Although I, of course, couldn't have the memories of Spier. He was born before me. But this is still something that we can imagine and can understand. It becomes rather stranger, a lot more stranger, when with my following example. And the following example is a very famous book, Dutch book, and that's called the Camera Obscura. That book was published in 1839 and written by a certain Nicolaas Bates. And the title of the book is quite illustrative. Camera Obscura, so that's, you have an association here with photography, and photography that had been discovered in the early 1830s, so that was an interesting phenomenon in those days. And this gave Bates the idea, what I want to do in my book, in my Camera Obscura, is to make a number of photographies of the Dutch social world of my time, so the Dutch world of 1835 to 1839. And he has been remarkably successful in this. When I read this book, and I read and reread the book, well, quite often, I should say, it has always a tremendous effect on me. And I can read hundreds of books of excellent historians on this period. The Dutch world of 1830 to 1840, I can read hundreds of very well excellent books on it, but none of these books, and even not all these books together, bring me so close to what it must have been to have lived in that time as this book by Bates, the Camera Obscura. But it also owes a lot to the illustrations in the book. And these illustrations, I will show you one. These are illustrations. This is one of the illustrations of in the Camera Obscura. They give you, in my view, a very, an inkling of what this world must have been like, and in this way, very strongly reinforces all these nostalgic dimensions that are already present in the book by Bates himself. And then you ask yourself, how does Speer succeed in doing this? How does Speer succeed with his drawings to make nostalgic feelings, to release nostalgic feelings in the people looking at these drawings? I think it has something to do with his procedure. Something is known about this, namely, he always started with what one might call a full drawing. So where he had all the details and where everything that reality looked like that was rendered in his initial painting. And then he started rubbing out and scratching out everything he believed to be unnecessary. And then what rested in the end was something like this. So just a few shivery and very thin lines, more suggestive, more suggestion than saying that something is the case in a certain way. It's more suggestion than getting a full image of a reality. The procedure reminds me a bit of what you probably know as the Jastrow-Wittgenstein drawing. You know, the drawing of the duck and the duck and the rabbit. And then the situation is that the duck-rabbit drawing, in which you can see both, always works only on the condition that it's not too detailed. For if it has some hairs here and there, then you say, oh, this can only be a duck, I mean a rabbit, for a rabbit only has hair. And if you, make the snavel, yeah, what is that? And you can also add some details which are specific for ducks, and then you will say, well, this is duck. But precisely the ambiguity, that's what is the point I want to make, the ambiguity of the Jastor Wittgenstein drawing, that's what counts. And this is also the effect that Spier succeeds in achieving in his paintings. He makes them ambiguous with regards to the past and the present. You can see both the past and the present in them. And why this is so and why this works in this way, this gets me to another story I wish to tell you about nostalgia. That's a story that was told by a Dutch psychologist in a book that was called The Nostalgia Factory. The Nostalgia Factory. And there he has a story of two people from emigrating from Friesland in the 1950s to Canada. And now speaking about Friesland, I have to tell you this about Friesland, that Friesland is a Dutch province, but not just one province like another. It is, so to speak, the essential, the prototypical Dutch province. I mean, if you ever visit the Netherlands and wish to see what is now typically Holland, then go to Friesland. There you have a completely flat country with the meadows cut through by ditches, farms, very huge farms, looking like pyramids or pagodas, as it has sometimes been described. And you have large lakes on which in the summer people are fishing there or sailing, and in the winters you have there the skating. And for example, the so-called we talked about is the 11 city tour, for which Friesland is famous. So this is a very particular part of the Netherlands, and so that is no mean thing to emigrate from Friesland to Canada. And this was then also, it was also to be expected that it was going to happen, that these people started to suffer terribly from homesickness. It was first the wife, Anna, was called Anna, and as she described, she said, well, first I couldn't eat nor sleep, and then she lost her hair, and then she got a feeling that she became mad, and in the end she became just simply suicidal. It was different with her husband Andries. In the first time he adapted fairly well to his new world in Canada, but then it became worse for him than for his wife. He suffered terribly from homesickness, to the extent even that they said, well, we shall return a few times from Canada to Friesland. They did so even up to 8 times. But even when being there, the homesickness went on, continued unabated. Even when he was there, he felt homesick. Even when he was in Friesland, he felt homesick. And this is something quite peculiar. It's different, of course, than with Anna. Anna had, well, the simple variant of spatial nostalgia. You feel nostalgic for a certain place, go there, and the nostalgia is over. But this was a different kind of nostalgia, since it did not go over even when Andries, this husband, was in the actual part of the world that he thought had provoked his nostalgic feelings. So how to explain this? In order to come to an explanation, I propose to distinguish two, if you don't mind me making things so complicated, 3 kinds of nostalgia. On the one hand, you have the kind of nostalgia that, the simple kind, so spatial nostalgia, for which is an easy remedy. It also has an object. The object is Switzerland or Friesland, so that's a wholly unproblematic kind of nostalgia. Then you have a temporal, the temporal variant of nostalgia, but that one I want now to distinguish. There are 2 kinds of nostalgia. On the one hand, you have the kind of nostalgia, temporal nostalgia, that has an object. For example, you want to go back to, well, the world of Nicolaas Beets in the Netherlands in 1835. But there is also one other kind of nostalgia, which I shall associate with the desire for timelessness. And this is the kind of nostalgia that Andries suffered from. For it was not, even when he went back, even when he was in Friesland, it was his nostalgia did not cease, and therefore it was something else. It was objectless, this kind of nostalgia he had, and this object could not be, since this object could not be identified with, well, with Friesland or whatever in Friesland that he might have this nostalgic feelings for. And when we try to make this clear, this distinction between these two forms of nostalgia, then I think this drawing by Jo Spier is quite helpful again. What you see here is again very ambiguous in the sense in which I need it here. You can say it's on the one hand, these are the Frisian lakes. There you see these reeds silhouetted against the water. You can say it is an object of spatial nostalgia. You can imagine that somebody living in Canada seeing this has this feeling of spatial nostalgia. But the peculiar thing is that it is also something which is timeless. These reeds have been there always in Friesland, they are there now, and they will be there in the future. So there's a dimension of timelessness, and this is also something that you might desire for. So not something specific, either spatial or temporal, but the timelessness. It looks, and that's there is the ambiguity. The ambiguity is that you have, on the one hand, temporal language, and on the other hand, spatial language. And indeed, this is the kind of thing that Spier knew to achieve. This one is ambiguous between the two of them. On the one hand, it is spatial, and on the other hand, it is temporal. And therefore, you have the ambiguity of the temporal nostalgia and of the spatial nostalgia here. And because we know that this ambiguity exists, we also know that we should keep these two things apart, and why it's necessary to distinguish between these two forms of temporal nostalgia. I'll elaborate that a little later. I wonder, is this a moment to stop for a moment, or shall I go on?
Can you all listen to
Yeah, I'll continue. Good. Then I turn now to this issue of timelessness. For actually, that's the basic theme in my talk today about nostalgia, to get to this idea of timelessness. And we have it now on the agenda, and the rest of my talk is devoted to elaborating it and making it more clear. I shall begin now with a famous book by Svetlana Boym. The book is called The Future of Nostalgia, published in 2002. A very good book, in my view. Well, I've always was part of course, of my job to keep auteur of the literature to see what is being published in the field. So also there has been considerable things have been published about nostalgia, but I think this book is in fact the best. So as we shall see, I have a quite fundamental disagreement with it. The main argument in the book by Svetlana Boym is that you should distinguish between two kinds of nostalgia. There's on the one hand the restorative nostalgia, and on the other hand the performative. On the one hand the restorative nostalgia, and on the other hand there is the reflective nostalgia. Well, she describes it here. Restorative nostalgia stresses nostos and attempts a transhistorical reconstruction of the lost home. Reflective nostalgia thrives on algia, the longing itself, and delays the homecoming wistfully, ironically, desperately. The past for the restorative nostalgic is a value for the present. The past is not a duration, but a snapshot. Moreover, the past is not supposed to reveal any signs of decay. It has to be freshly painted in its original image and retain eternally young. Reflective nostalgia is more concerned with historical and individual time, with the irrevocability of the past and of human finitude. The contrast between the two had best been described as follows. That restorative nostalgia, just look at the, at the name restorative, is the idea that you can restore the past in the way it has actually been. And they think, for example, indeed of restoration techniques. So you have a painting of the 15th or 16th century, and then you can be, as a restorative nostalgian, you can hope to restore that painting in its former glory. You take off all the varnish and the dirt and the dust that has been gathered on the painting in the course of the centuries, and you are sure that underneath it all you will find the original, she says it somewhere, you find it, yeah, the original image, this third line from below, the original image can then be restored. And that's restorative nostalgia. It gets you back to the past as it has actually been. That's the illusion, but anyway, the hope and the expectation of restorative nostalgia, that everything that separates the past as it has been from the present can be removed, like the varnish and the dust and the dirt on a painting, and that you then see the past again in its original form. And then the reflective nostalgian will say, well, that is not, that you will never come that far. For the reflective nostalgian will say, restoration techniques also have a history. Each historical period restored the paintings from the past in a different way. And each time they thought, well, if we restore it this way, we will get to the original painting. And then you get a later generation of restorators. They say, oh no, these people made terrible mistakes and they mishandled the painting, they distorted it. And what they thought was the original painting was not in the least the original painting. And that goes on and on. And each historical period having its own restoration techniques is discovered to have, at a later generation, to have been mistaken about this, and that each period fails somewhere in its hope, in its idle hope to recreate the past as it has actually been. That's also why it's now the ethos of in restoration techniques that you may never actually destroy something in the actual painting. Everything you do as a restorer of a painting must be reversible, so that future generations of restorers, well, can undo what you have done, but without encountering the situation that something is now radically lost and cannot be put on the right place again. So we have now a restoration technique that has also, as it were, incorporated the knowledge of the weakness of all these idealizations of former restoration techniques. This is gets you to the issue of the timelessness. But before I get there, I think I best say right away how I look at the book by Boehm. And this is roughly as follows. I would say that I completely agree with her. I can understand what she means by this distinction between restorative and informative and reflective nostalgia. But I would say that reflective historia you would better call just simply historical writing, associated or place it on the same level as historical writing. So this reflective kind of nostalgia, that's dealing with the past, or with paintings, that's dealing with the past as historians are actually expected to do. So it has nothing intrinsically to do anymore with nostalgia. So that's what I'm saying with regard to this reflective nostalgia. Whereas restorative nostalgia, there I shall go on using that we have there these three kinds of nostalgia of time, of space, and that time has two variants as well. But I begin now by to explain to you why I think that the discovery or the insight by Boehm that you can never get to the actual past is not a disaster at all and can be seen instead as a justification of ordinary historical writing. That was my argument just now. You have this reflective kind of nostalgia. You can never get back to the original painting. You always keep somewhere in between. You always keep hanging in somewhere between. And then she said, well, this is a bad thing, and therefore it should also be a kind of nostalgia. No, I would say this is just what you have with the history. For it's not bad at all that you keep hanging somewhere in between. That's what is peculiar to all of historical writing. It's no reason for despair at all. This is what I'm now going to explain to you. And I'll do this by having recourse to a very famous article by Thomas Nagel. The article is entitled, What It Is Like to Be a Bat. Some of you know this article? Well, it's like this. You know that bats, just like us, can perceive the world. But they have a perception system that's different from ours. We perceive the world with our eyes, but bats have a kind of radar system. So radar works by sending out electromagnetic rays, and then these are come back again, and then you know where an object is. And this is what bats do with sonar, with noise. And so they have a kind of radar system enabling them to see the world. This is how perception works with them. And then you may ask this question, what is it like to see the world as a bat? So what's it like to see the world as a bat? And that's a very meaningful and sensible question. And a lot of things can be said about it, especially because of all the technical means and modern technical means that we now have for dealing with such with this problem. But then the essential insight by Nagel is this, that if we make use of all these means, if we start thinking about what it is like to be a bat and do it as thorough and as detailed as possible and go on with this as long as we can, all we will ultimately reach is that we can know what it would be for us to be a bat. But we will never get as far what it will be for a bat to be a bat. What you can explain with all these machines and all these techniques is, oh, now you see me, I see you. It's now for me, I now see what it is for me to be a bat. But what it is for a bat to be a bat, and that's actually what you wanted to know, you will never get as far as that. And that's a very deep insight, for it works also in history, of course. For example, you want to understand the Middle Ages, you want to understand how the medieval mind worked. Then you can also say, well, what was it like to be a person living in the Middle Ages, instead of what was it like to be a bat? But it's basically the same sort of question, and you get the same kind of answer. That all you can do as a historian is to come to the conclusion what it must have been, or what it will be for us to have lived in such a period in the Middle Ages, but we will never be capable of saying what it was for someone who actually lived in the Middle Ages to be somebody who lived in the Middle Ages. The implication of this goes very far, for it means actually that you should do away with all of hermeneutics and of the whole of the Verstehen theory. For hermeneutics always wanted to relive the past and believed it to be possible to relive the past as it actually has been. And this argument of Nagel shows this to be an illusion. But again, no reason for despair. And this is something that I now want to make clear to you by turning to Arthur Dento. When we start to think about the past and to write about the past and about how we should represent the past, the first thing that we should realize is this, that you have past events. Events like 44 before Christ, then Caesar was murdered. In 1793 you had Louis XVI was guillotined. 1933 the Second World War broke out. And these are all events. But we should understand and be very much aware that these events as events are neither past, present, nor future. It's only our position with regard to these events that makes them either past or present or future. For example, if you live in 44, then you could say, well, the murder of Caesar in 44 is present. Do you live in the year 50 after Christ, then you say it's in the past, and so on. Easy enough. But it has the funny consequence that when the past is still present, when the past exists, when these facts exist, it is not yet historical reality. And so the funny thing is that historical reality is not as yet historical reality when it's still present. Let me put it differently. Historical reality is not historical reality as long as it is still present reality. If you say, well, from our point of view, these events, 44, etc., these were historical reality. At that time, they were not historical reality, but still actually existing reality. Historical reality only comes into being when we look at the past from a later perspective. And then this, what we see from a later perspective, this historical reality is then no longer historical reality. For this historical reality is something that is in between the past and the present in which we live. I think I should make it more clearer than I now see it. Yeah, let me put it this way. When the past of 44 and 1793, etc., still existed, it was not the past, but still present reality. Yeah? That is when you lived still in 44 and 1789. It was not historical reality, but still existing historical reality. So historical reality should never be associated with the past, as we always tend to do. It's the commonsensical opinion, commonsensical view to say, well, where is the past? And we say, well, it's in the past itself. But that's wrong. Historical reality only comes into being when the past no longer exists. And that's that's the basic thing I actually want to say here to this evening. That historical reality only comes into being when the past no longer exists. For as long as the past still exists, it's not yet historical reality. Yeah, I suppose that some of you might still be in trouble about this. Do you have a question about it? Yeah?
Historical reality is not the past, because you did the reading about that.
No, it's not a matter of experience. It's a matter of what you call past and present and historical reality. The first step is, again, that nothing is intrinsically past, present, or future. But you can say, when you live in 44, that the world in which Caesar is murdered is existing reality. But from a later perspective, when you look at it from a later perspective, it's no longer existing reality. It's no longer reality. For what exists no longer is no longer reality. Reality is only that what exists. The past exists no more. And therefore, historical reality should always be associated with this distance between the past and the present. Reality in the past, as common sense requires us to do, but always say historical reality comes into being when the past no longer exists. First, the past has to die. First, the past has to die, and then historical reality comes into being. Yeah?
So, what could be the difference between historical reality and historical experience?
No, that's a very complicated question. I would say that I have carefully left out the issue of historical experience here. But
reality is reality in the way it's experienced. The past there is no past reality because there's no one can could experience.
Well, the idea of let me say, with the experience of the past, historical experience has to do with the moment that the past and the present diverge, so to speak. When the past becomes an objectified entity opposite to us, and there is an historical experience in the sense that you just until that moment you were one, past and present were one. But because of some tremendous upheaval, the past becomes loosens from the present. It's an experience which always goes together with a feeling of pain and loss, for you lose a great deal of yourself, and that's the historical experience. But that's not at stake here. Here is at stake that, well, the more simple question that historical reality comes into being when the past no longer exists, and that we should never ever be tempted to project historical reality in the past as we always tend to do, as common sense requires us to do. This gets me to to Dento. This is the quote, I read it, and something of the same sort is true for the historical period considered as an entity. It is a period solely from the perspective of the historian who sees it from without. For those who lived in the period, it would be just the way life was lived. And asked afterwards what it was like to have lived then, they may answer from the outside, from the historian's perspective. From the inside, there is no answer to be given. It was simply the way things were. So when the members of a period can give an answer in terms satisfactory to the historian, the period will have exposed its outward surface and in a sense be over as a period. Here you have the same idea again that the past only comes into being if you have taken your distance from it. Only then, if you have this, if a period is seen from the outside, if you live at a later phase, at a later stage, only then you can say then there is a past reality, but this past reality should not be identified with the world when it was still the kind of world that Dento associates here with the inside. From the inside, there was no past or no past or real reality to be seen. And I now would like to ask you to focus on the passage where he speaks about the inside and the outside and says that from the inside there is no answer to be given. This is where Dento wishes to express that the way was simply, it was simply the way things were, that you don't make then in that stage, you use no temporal terms. The whole category of past, present, and future is then absent still in that phase. This is what the Dento has in mind with what I have been calling a moment before the timelessness. The timelessness, the dimension of the timelessness, and that's we discovered when describing the experiences of Andries. Well, that gets me then to the end of my paper. That I can illustrate with the story by Lenau. Lenau was a romantic poet from the early 19th century. He lived from 1802 to 1850. And he wrote this poem, Möchte wieder in der Gegend. So I wish to return to the place where I once knew boundless happiness, where I lived and dreamed the most wonderful years of my youth. This is how I yearned from so far away from my youth, believing that in this old world, my old happiness could be rediscovered. Finally, fate accorded to me the return to the valley so well known to me. But he who returned is in a mood so badly different from them. It's from the beginning the kind of nostalgia we know so well. Somebody who has a nostalgic feeling for his youth. He wants to return to his youth, and then he goes back to the place where he had spent his youth. He sees there everything that was to be what he had hoped to find there. He saw the valleys and greeted them like old friends, but nevertheless, he did not come in the mind that he did not experience the same kind of mind that he had remembered when he was a young boy, when he was a youth, when he actually walked there. And the explanation is to take again the words the words from Nigel, that what he could do is try to evoke what a let's say 40-year-old Lenau must have been to be the youth of 10 or 12 years. And who, as we have seen with Dento, who lived in a period of timelessness, the timelessness of youth, when time had no role to play. in that timelessness, he could answer himself, he could try to find the answer to the question what it would be for him to live that, but what it actually was, this timelessness for the youth of 10 or 12 years old himself, that's something that he could never get at, as Nagel had so abundantly made clear. Now, if I sum then the story all up, you have again, with regard to nostalgia, these three kinds of nostalgia, the unproblematic kind, spatial nostalgia. There you have an object. Next, there is the temporal kind of nostalgia that may have an object. For example, in the case of the Camera Obscura, the Netherlands of 1830. And then you have the kind of temporal experience for the timelessness, that you just want to go back to a world of timelessness, the timelessness of use. It seems to be an object, but it is not an object. It's timelessness. Then to turn to Boehm with regard to a story about the restorative and reflective nostalgia. It's true that we never can get to the actual past as actual as the was desired by the restorative nostalgia. But that's not bad, for history gives us in fact the same as reflective history, as reflective nostalgia wishes to give us. For history can also not go back to the past as it has actually been, with the same argument that Nagel has already given to us. Then the last question is, of course, whether nostalgic feelings are in themselves bad or good, whether we should forget about them, should drive them out, condemn them, or prevent them. But I think that would be a counterproductive procedure. This with nostalgic feelings, I think, as with everything in nature, and where you have the Latin proverb, naturam repellas furca tamen usque recurret, so you can try to drive out nature with a fork, but it will always return. So that would make no sense. Well, I hope I have given you an idea of what I wanted to say about nostalgia, but I suppose that many questions will arrive, to live with you, and I'm happy to answer them.
Very much. We do have some time for questions. If you, I don't know. Okay, yeah, Oliver, please.
Well, thanks for the interesting talk. Actually, I enjoyed it a lot because I'm thinking about nostalgia myself recently quite a bit. But also about another concept. The other concept would be the concept of melancholia. And there are a couple of Mexican thinkers, UDIR, for instance, who was working on with the concept of melancholia. And if I understood Bartra well, and also others who are trying to establish a distinction between nostalgia on the one hand and melancholia on the other hand, I think the difference would be that precisely melancholia would be a kind of nostalgia without an object. Right? I mean, it would be this experience of loss that is given a name by melancholia, and nostalgia would be more like what you said. I mean, it would be like a kind of melancholia, an experience of loss that has an object. So I wonder if actually the third kind of nostalgia that you mentioned, the nostalgia of timelessness, actually does have an object. I mean, is it an object? Is timelessness an object of nostalgia? Or should we then rather use the concept of melancholia, which would be only an experience of loss without an object?
Yeah, I feel much sympathy for your proposal. I think that relating this kind of nostalgia as nostalgia of timelessness with melancholia would make sense, if only if I think of this case of Andries, the Frisian farmer. One would certainly say he was in a melancholic state, and there was nothing that could get him out of it. And so yes, the irreparable of the situation of timelessness, not having an object. Yes, yeah, I think I could agree with your proposal. Yes, yeah.
Are there any other questions? Yeah, okay. I would actually do like well, there's a passage I don't quite understand, which has to do with the relationship between nostalgia and history, in the sense that there's not a pathos, there's not a suffering in the historian himself when he tries to retrieve that object from the past. And I don't know if I got it right, or does history has like history as as an effort to reconstruct that past without any sense of loss or pain would have no would have no space in this discussion.
Well, I think it's a bit like this. I have the impression that Mrs. Boehm herself still has a certain sympathy, a certain tendency to fall back on the idea of restorative nostalgia, and that she therefore does not, is unwilling to entertain the idea to associate reflective nostalgia with historical writing. And actually, I think that the argument by Ernest Nagel makes clear that for both historical writing itself, if you think, for example, or what the historian tries to do, he tries to get to the past itself, and we have seen with Nagel that this will never be successful. And it is, well, what historical debate continues to show that each time something new turns up, so you never get to what the past actually has been. In this way, if you characterize it in this way, reflective nostalgia can be located in the same domain as well, what we normally when we normally place historical writing itself.
Well, then I would like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And well, tomorrow we'll also have a seminar with Professor Ankersmith. In case you wanted to participate, the idea is that we have all read the text beforehand, so we'll be able to discuss it. Although Professor Ankersmith himself told me he would actually, he will take quite a long time to explain the basics of this text. So for those of you who have received it and found it unfamiliar because maybe you are not that acquainted with philosophical arguments, well, you don't need to worry because Professor Ankersmith will explain it all. And in case you're acquainted with them, well, all the more so we would have a lot of room to discuss this text. So if you're interested in participating, just, well, tell me and I'll send you the text. And now, well, I guess it's time to thank as well Professor Ankersmith for his wonderful talk and to sharing all these reflections with us. a beautiful talk. I really like the subject.
Yeah, well, has something to do with the fact that I didn't turn up this morning for our talk, for our meeting. I said you this morning that something came up and I worked it in, but I didn't work it.
And but you did mention it during your talk, or you did not?
Yes, well, so this morning when preparing myself, some new things turned up with me, and I tried to work in it, but actually had a little bit too some.
Your call will be disconnected.
Se desconectará la llamada.